Hello, everybody. I'm Eli Lake of the New York Sun, and I'm here today with Jacob Heilbrunn, author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. And so how about if I'm Alcove 1 and you be Alcove 2?
Okay. Hi, I'm Jacob, as Eli said, and I'm a senior editor at the National Interest, as well as being the author of the book. And Eli, you can go ahead and be Alcove 1, and I'll be Alcove 2, which was the good guys.
Yes. I guess, Alcove 1 makes me the Bolsheviks, does it not?
Yes.
Oh, God. All right, I picked the wrong alcove. All right, so listen, first of all, this is a kind of an intellectual history of neoconservatives starting from the Trotsky days of City University and leading to the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon. We travel through Commentary Magazine, Scoop Jackson's Senate office, the Reagan administration to get there. So I wanted to first ask you, what is it that ties the kind of, inclinations of Leon Trotsky with the literary criticism of Norman Podhoretz, the classic kind of philosophical criticism of Leo Strauss, the logical analysis of of Wohlstetter, with the thinking of the sort of muscular democracy promotion of a Paul Wolfowitz. What is there like a single way that you can sort of say this all coheres into one movement or ideology?
I think the answer of the neocons would be no. I myself tried to show that there are different schools of thought within neoconservatism, but it was interesting to me, for example, that Albert Wohlstetter, who is a prominent defense intellectual and helped shape neoconservative thinking of Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, who were influential in both the Reagan and Bush administration defense departments, that Albert Wohlstetter himself was actually a Trotskyist. And I began it with the Trotskyist history to show that the neocons were attracted to a grandiose conception of themselves and that they always saw themselves as an elite, a small group of intellectuals who could not simply influence but even steer the course of history. And that's what Trotsky was about. I wasn't trying to imply that the neocons today, as some of their critics allege, are in fact Trotskyists, but rather to point to the influence that it had on their mode of argumentation, which is very combative, and their conception of history as a great drama of salvation.
Now, this leads you in the introduction to say that neoconservatism is largely a Jewish American, and I would use the word Ashkenazi, phenomenon, which is to say that it really is born of the sort of sense of the Jew as the outsider, and also the memory of the Holocaust and the fight against totalitarianism and fascism. Draw that out a little bit, because in the wrong hands, and I'm certainly not accusing Jacob of making it, but in the wrong hands, that we're in Lyndon LaRouche territory.
Well, I would take the opposite tack. I would say one of the problems with the neoconservative movement is that it has fumbled in dealing with this issue. Clearly, many neoconservatives are driven by the desire to protect Israel's security, and they are influenced by the Holocaust. The first issue of Commentary in 1945 deals directly with this issue. How could you not, would be my argument. The problem with the neoconservatives is that when they're attacked by their enemies as being agents of Israel, they go overboard and deny that there's any influence of their Jewish heritage on the movement. And that just seemed nonsensical to me. And the more I looked back at the origins of the movement, the whole Trotskyist phase, the influence of radical socialism, of Marxist thought in Russia, the kind of pitched battles that you had even in Russia between among various Jewish intellectual camps, the whole debates over Zionism, all of these things have influenced neoconservatism. And to me, it seems preposterous to claim, as some have, including Richard Pearl, a year or two ago, tried to downplay this. I just think they should acknowledge it and not protest so much. I don't think it's a damning indictment to say that neoconservatism has been shaped by Jewish concerns. And in fact, there are quotations in my book from Norman Podhoretz in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where he says, we really do have to view all of these issues through the lens of how it affects Israel. So at that point, I think there was more openness about it. I think since then, it's become somewhat taboo among the neoconservatives. And my book just tries to look at this directly and forthrightly.
Well, I don't like the kind of charge when it comes from the Walt Mearsheimer quarter. I mean, let me just say, I think it's factually wrong in the following sense, which is that the government of Israel, especially in the last 20 years, it's been, from a foreign policy perspective, very realist. The intelligence service of the Israelis, particularly the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Mossad, is thick as thieves with the CIA, the bureaucratic enemies of the neoconservatives. And from, the neoconservatives, especially in the Bush years, at the end, a lot of them, though there was a schism with an article, I think, in 2005 by Charles Krauthammer, believed that American interests were, or the national interest was interconnected and bound up in the promotion of democracy, and that ultimately American security, or for that matter, Israeli security, or the security of the free world, was contingent on democracy in the Middle East and the Muslim world. And the Israelis hate the idea of Muslim democracy. They hate the idea of Arab democracy, and they'd much rather deal with all the devils they know. So they complain about the House of Saud, but at the end of the day, they very much value the nightmare scenario for them is if the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan falls, the Saudis fall, and then it is replaced with what they would see as something far more radical. So in my estimation, the neoconservatives are actually advocating a foreign policy which is very much at odds with the formulation of Israel's national interest by the people who formulate Israel's national interest. So while I think that there is definitely a concern for the well-being of Israel, just like neoconservatives are concerned for Taiwan and would like to see a free China, just like neoconservatives were, concerned for the, Eastern European states living under Soviet Union, it's not necessarily synonymous with, what at least when Juan Cole writes it, and I think in the first essay from Walt Mearsheimer, would be the sort of charge that it's basically a lobby on behalf of a foreign government, which is just, it's piffle.
Okay, Eli, let's deal first with the Walt Mearsheimer, because my complaint with them wasn't that their argument was illegitimate. I don't agree with it, but it was the slipshod manner in which they made it. They're essentially ignorant about Israel, and we're just using every cudgel they could to bash it. So Walt and Mearsheimer, to me, in a sense, aren't that interesting. The reaction that they provoked is probably more interesting than the book itself. But I do not think that you can argue that the neoconservative outlook when it comes to Taiwan is the same as it is towards Israel. Let's face it, and I'm partly speaking from personal experience, of course. This book is in some ways a generational odyssey of younger people who are sympathetic to the neocons in their 30s and 40s. I'm not the only one who feels this way. The thing about Israel is there is an emotional attachment, and to me, an understandable one. Now, the neocons, yes, they went further to the right than many in Israel, and many Israelis are highly skeptical, if not scornful, of the idea of a democratization crusade in the Middle East. They are realists. However, it is also true that the neocons have very close links. They had very close links to the Likud and to Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's not just like Taiwan. I think Taiwan and the intervention in the Balkans in the 1990s, which the neocons supported, show that they are not simply fixated on Israel. But Israel plays, I think, a much bigger role than you seem to be willing to concede in the neocon.
Well, I mean, listen, are neoconservative writers, do they tend to focus on the Middle East and the problems or the security of Israel more than some of these other issues? I mean, I suppose it depends on the neocon. I mean,
yes, I think someone like
focuses more on Taiwan than me. I don't know, but I mean, it is. But I would argue that insofar as neoconservatives, at least in the early aughts, which is we don't have a good word for the early years of this decade, but neoconservatives really believed in the idea that democracy was interlinked with our national interest and our national security, and that model would be applied, kind of across the globe. But the threat of 9/11 emanated from the Middle East. But I mean, I would just point out though that when you read some of the academic left talking about neocons, they are using the word to mean agents of the Likud party or the government of Israel, which is absurd. And because neoconservatives don't really have much traction, far less traction, I would argue, in Jerusalem than they do in Washington.
Well, that's the interesting point. You've just hit on the interesting point. Do the neocons, in fact, influence the debate in Washington on behalf of Israel, or what they perceive as Israel's interests?
No, I would argue that they influence it on what they perceive as freedom, and that what they perceive as what they think is a morally correct foreign policy. Now, first of all, I don't know any neoconservatives today who would argue that we can invade other countries at this point. But insofar as I think that neoconservatives will have taken an interest in figuring out effective ways to support liberals and dissidents in closed societies, in much the same way that Soros in the 90s did the same in the former Soviet Union, this is something that is of no concern whatsoever to the people who have their levers on power in the Israeli government. Period. I mean, it's just and so the two things are kind of, and I find it odd because one of the things that you hear from the academic left is that they're forever being censored and silenced by charges of anti-Semitism, which is when they themselves what they want to say is they want to say, well, we would think we should be able to be allowed into polite society and accuse.
But Eli, I think you're more interested in the academic left than I am concerning this debate, because I think the real debate is in Washington and at places like the Council on Foreign Relations. But I'm not convinced that the academic left is really the bogeyman here. What I think we're omitting from this discussion so far is that many people think that the neocons, after 9/11, opportunistically seized upon it, believed that they were creating, yes, more freedom in the Middle East, but also that the neocons are accused of believing that it would create peace between Israel and the Palestinians, that the road to peace ran through Baghdad rather than through some kind of modus vivendi between the Israelis and Palestinians directly, and that the neocons have in fact created a catastrophic war that has boomeranged in every respect, and instead of creating the freedom that you're talking about in the Middle East, they have emboldened radical Islamist groups, both in the Middle East, in Algeria, and were mired in a war in Afghanistan that doesn't seem to be doing well, and Pakistan.
Well, how is Afghanistan a neocon war? I mean, how is that?
Because why did we go to fight in Iraq would be the argument, and that was very much a war pushed, say, by Paul. It was a neocon brainchild that had been emanating.
So you're saying that the reason why we're mired in Afghanistan is because we don't have the troops are in Iraq?
We pulled troops out of Afghanistan before we should have to fight in Iraq. We did not prosecute the war in Afghanistan as we should have, and we are, I believe, paying the price because Osama bin Laden should have been nailed. This whole band should have been nailed at the time. We were not vigilant enough, and we got mired in a sideshow. In my view, I believe we will ultimately prevail in Iraq, but I don't think that it was a necessary war.
Well, I think history or time will tell. I've been pretty critical of a lot of the prosecution of that war, and but I mean, a point, and I think you actually make it in the book, which is good because. I want to compliment you on this point, which is that you managed to sort of deal with the subject, particularly of the neoconservatives, in the Bush administration without resorting to the shrieking tones of like a Sidney Blumenthal. So, I mean, and I mean that in the say that you capture a lot of the. I think in some cases I disagree with it, but you also capture a lot of the nuances that there were compromises that were made. But I mean, I just keep remembering that. I mean, you devote some time to discussion of liberal hawks, but there were a lot of people who understood Saddam to be a threat. And if you remember, with Iraq was this sole exception of states after 9/11 that did not in any way offer cooperation with the United States after, you're either with us or against us. And it was in a kind of international double, triple jeopardy with regards to the fact that they had never answered any of the questions that were, or they had never met the terms of the 1991 ceasefire. And, I am largely in agreement with you, and I never, by the way, wrote that Saddam had meaningful connections with Al-Qaida. However, Al-Qaida did manage to establish itself in Iraq shortly after the invasion and devoted quite a bit of resources to it. And the argument that Al-Qaida or the Baathists could never cooperate because Al-Qaida was an Islamist group and deeply concerned about theology, whereas the Baathists were sort of these secularists, was also proven wrong. And I mean, it's a sort of side point, but I'm just saying that the two did end up, or rather Al-Qaida ended up sort of at one point in 2006 largely subsuming the entire insurgency.
Again, but the argument of the person that's opposed to the war is going to say precisely, you've outlined why we shouldn't have gone into Iraq, because we had Saddam pinned down in a kind of containment situation with a no-fly zone where we were bombing Iraq and we had sanctions and the economy was crumbling inside Iraq, and essentially Saddam Hussein, let's face it, was a spent force. We created a monster where you essentially had a tin pot dictator, and who managed to control the country with ruthless force, which worked, but in no way.
I would argue the effect of our sanctions was to impoverish and malnourish millions of Iraqis.
No doubt, but it also
and consolidate Saddam's power. And if you really kind of dig under, like, what was the cause of the intelligence failure, it was not, at least on the weapons of mass destruction, which was the ostensible reason for why we invaded. The reason was because our best sources in the Arab world had been wrong as well. And at least there's some argument that was in the Foreign Affairs piece that was based on a lot of the captured documents that was written, I think, in 2006 or 2007, that suggested that Saddam himself thought that he had these weapons of mass destruction. One of his...
Well, he may have, because his own advisors were too scared to tell him the truth. I mean, you would have been...
Well, but I'm saying,
we're living in a fantasy land in that...
Yeah, I'm just saying, we are a far, far cry. We're miles away from the Joe Wilson thesis there, aren't we? I mean, come on. I mean, it's apples and oranges. I mean, but I guess what I'm saying is that, I don't buy the argument that, like, well, he was pinned down and everything was fine. It's easy to say that in 2020 hindsight.
True. I think the sanctions would eventually have eroded.
Well, they were eroding. They were eroding in 2000. Sandy Berger gave a speech at the end of the Clinton administration saying, I think in December 2000, saying that the sanctions are not working. We're going to have to look at other options. He didn't spell them out. But one of the reasons why Bill Clinton, Richard Holbrooke, Sandy Berger, Madeleine Albright supported the Iraq War was because they knew that they had felt that Saddam was not contained, and that was not a kind of a wild neoconservative notion. That was a widely accepted notion. The people that I remember largely opposing the war, there were two schools. One school was the kind of disgruntled realists, like a Brent Scowcroft, who warned of the calamitous effects of trying to occupy an Arab nation. And of course, we later learned Richard Clarke, who was in the government at the time, who came out. And those, I think, arguments really do, in fairness, bear out. The occupation certainly was
Unfortunately, if you look at that Wall Street Journal piece that Scowcroft wrote in August,
in the Middle East,
he nailed not everything, but he nailed many of the things that would occur. And I think you're overlooking the fact that the Pentagon assiduously, there was I don't want to use the word conspiracy, but there were, let's face it, the Office of Special Plans, there's nothing wrong with examining what the CIA had come up with, but their purpose was to interpret everything in the worst light possible to justify that Saddam Hussein was somehow in cahoots with Al-Qaida. Wildly exaggerated.
Well, that was the Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, and the Office of Special Plans, as I understand it, was not so much an intelligence operation as it was, a planning operation. But yes,
they had an office where.
Well, listen. It should be said that just in two things, and I'm not. I am agnostic in large part on the, as I said. And if I could remind readers, maybe we can put it on the sidebar, that I wrote a piece in 2002 in September saying that there was a fight between neoconservatives in the administration and the CIA regarding this very question of Saddam's ties to Al-Qaida. So I was never as much on board about that. And but what I would just sort of that aside. All three people in that counterterrorism evaluation group, David Wormser, Chris Carney, who's now a member of Congress, and Mike Maloof, all stand by. They say, "Listen, we thought the intelligence work was right," and it's for reasons that are beyond me. This document remains classified, I'm just saying I'd like to see it. I'd like to see the actual intelligence because we've heard a lot about it. But as I remember it, the argument at the time and afterwards against how there was no significant connection was largely based on this argument about how the two groups could never cooperate, which they proved in the war to actually cooperate. And Saddam himself at times proved to have this Islamist bent, where there were some connections. I mean, I interviewed once Bob Kerry, who, as you point out, was a liberal hawk who supported the Iraq Liberation Act and was on the 9/11 Commission, and he said, there were some things that we saw that showed that there was some connection. But it clearly wasn't what Milroy wrote. It clearly wasn't anything sort of significant. And then the fact that in the public view that Saddam was responsible for 9/11, well, that's just wrong.
But that view was, again, assiduously propagated by the Bush administration, where President Bush constantly tried to link Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaida and constantly tried to act as though this were some big front in the war against terrorism. The truth
I don't remember it that way, Jacob. I remember President Bush saying that we're not going to wait on threats while they gather. I think what Bush was saying is that we need to employ preemption. And the argument from the left, we're talking about Scowcroft's argument, the argument from the left was that preemption was a terrible doctrine or a terrible sort of precedent, which is interesting because actually we've always had, a kind of preemption doctrine in the country. We just, but when wars go badly, but the argument, as I remember from Bush, was largely that we can't run the risk of having another 9/11, so we have to take care of this threat. And as far as, if you just take Al-Qaida out of it and you look at the wider question of, was this a state that was willing to use terrorism as statecraft? Was this a state that was believed by almost everyone to be amassing weapons of mass destruction? The answer to both those questions was yes.
Well, I think they are not. That in fact Saddam Hussein, as we know, did not have WMD. That the regime its back was essentially broken after the Gulf War. And what happened in the CIA and the intelligence services, which is perhaps understandable enough, is that they got caught flat-footed the first time. They saw that Saddam had in fact made much more progress than anyone had realized on the nuclear weapons front, and it was essentially shuttered. I mean, we had Saddam's own chief nuclear weapons scientist wrote that biography a few years ago, which I wrote about, and he confessed, it was basically a charade. Saddam
at the time, but we also had a guy who the CIA believed named Khidr Hamza, who was wrong, but he described what he said was a diffuse centrifuge program throughout the country that, was hidden underneath schools and hospitals and so forth.
Well, the reason this is interesting, Eli, of course, is because we're debating the same question today with Iran. There's a report in the New York Times. Now the Iranians themselves say that they're reprocessing the fuel much more quickly than they have been.
Yeah. Well,
so
if you want to get into Iran, the Iran is so much further along in terms of what we already know with regards to their.
So tell me, why did it make more sense to attack Iraq than to attack Iran if you're going to play the neocon mindset? Why is Michael Ledeen right that we should have gone after Iran?
Yeah, well, that's you raise a very interesting point. I wrote a column a few months ago, which was, if I was a Democrat and I wanted to prove that neocons were wrong, I would point to North Korea and Iran, which is to say that any demonstration effect of Iraq obviously didn't happen. The opposite happened, and Iran accelerated, it appears, its program to build nuclear weapons. Instead, what we've seen from the Democrats is that, we just don't believe that any of these countries are, if any country that you tell us about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, we just, it's just more, Bush propaganda or something. So, but in fact, the problem is that in the case of Iraq, by having a huge presence in Iraq, we have opened up a new vulnerability as a counterattack if we were to decide to take action against the Iranian nuclear program.
That's correct, though. I wrote in the New National
That's what
Interest.
the Israelis told me when I was there for the Hezbollah war, which is, I was covering that, from Egypt, and then I went to Israel to cover it. And everyone I talked to in their defense establishment was bemoaning what a disaster the Iraq war was from that perspective, which was that, do you think it would have come to this with Iran had, you not invaded Iraq? And I have to say that in that respect, I think I agree with them. That said, I think that there's one point I want to make, and I don't know if it's not. I don't think it's tangential, but it's very common for people to say that this Iraq war has become a rallying point for, as you said, Algiers and other Arabs to join Al-Qaida, and it is a mindset of many who are critical of the neocons, which is that we have to worry about things that we do that are used to help recruit people to the jihadist movements. But the other thing I would say is this: is that one of the hopeful signs that we've seen in the last year as a result, I think, of the Anbar Salvation Front and now what's called the Sons of Iraq, is that you also see an opposite effect, which is that Al-Qaida is so horrible and venal that there's also what I like to call the blast radius thesis, which is that if you are a Muslim and you live under Salafi control, there's going to be a reaction to that as well, which is, I think that there's a good chance that we will say in 5 years that because of the atrocities of Al-Qaida, which, by the way, dwarf any other atrocities in Iraq, in my estimation, you will find that Salafism and sort of Islamic jihadism has been discredited for generations.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think what we're going to end up with in Iraq is a wash, which is why it doesn't really redound to America's benefit. We went in there, we waged a catastrophic war for several years. We may come out of it with some kind of authoritarian regime. That's the best case. The worst case is you have a harshly restrictive government based on Sharia, on Muslim law. That would be terrible for the Iraqis themselves. And
I totally disagree with that. I think I can give you a much better best case, I think.
Well, you can spin any fantasies we want to, but
it's not a fantasy. I think that you've got a chance to have finally a competent military and intelligence force that will have a kind of generational enmity against the forces of jihad in the Middle East. You will also have the beginnings of a free society in places where, particularly in Kurdistan, but I think you'll also find that there are a number of people who want to, there's an expectation for having at least elections. I think that we're not destined to have a sort of strong man, and nor are we destined to have this sort of petty regional despots. It's certainly a possibility, and I'm not saying I would guarantee that, but I think that there's the tide in many ways has been turned, and I think you can find Iraq over time become a beacon for the rest of the region.
Well, that would be great. I hope it happens. What I see is no government in Baghdad, and until there is some kind of central government that can maintain order in Iraq, I'm not convinced that what the United States is doing is anything more than a holding action. I think it's a necessary one at this point, But whether that's really going to take, and to me, it seems at this moment pie in the sky to predict an Iraq that's a model for the rest of the region. I don't have those kind of expectations. I think the best case scenario for the U.S. is that it's able to extricate itself and not leave chaos behind in the area. And this is the central conundrum, let's face it, for the neocons, which is, again, it gets back to my point. I think the region today in the Middle East is more dangerous than it was, both for the United States and for Israel, than before we invaded Iraq.
Well, I mean, the region kind of, you could argue, produced the hijackers of 9/11 before we invaded Iraq. And the region certainly, it's in the following sense on Iranian nuclear proliferation, I would agree with you, and it's the point that I made before. But I think that the state structure and the political system in the Arab world was itself a kind of indirect cause of the instability that led to the efficacy in the information age of Islamic jihadists. So, in that respect, I think that at a certain point, there are things that could have been a lot better done in Iraq, and I'm very sympathetic to the argument that you made about focusing the troops in Afghanistan and ultimately probably the provinces of Pakistan. But I mean, we seem to think that. I mean, I think you would have found the same kind of resentment in Europe and the Middle East if we wherever we were. I mean, I think that Americans resent power not because of Bush, because we're the top dog. I'm not Americans, but I'm saying the world resents us in some ways because we're the top dog, and we would have still had a lot of this, and so.
Well, the problem that Bush made, his mistake, fine. You're always going to have some resentment of American power. Though in the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, America was widely admired around the world. We seem to have gotten over this sort of. It wasn't widely.
That's like the biggest myth in the world. People resented the United States in the Middle East throughout the entire Oslo process.
Well, one of the maybe to some extent, but what Bush did was to flaunt it, and that he went out with his cowboy act and the braggadocio and rubbed people's noses in it. And we are reaping the benefits of that, so to speak.
I mean, you should have seen.
Look at Russia and China today. I mean, they are more hostile than they've ever been to the United States. It's not solely because of Bush, but he certainly accelerated the process.
Listen, I'm not saying that I mean it's an interesting kind of counterfactual, but. Bush is not the person who's like I mean, there's a resentment that's been building way before Bush. I would argue one of the reasons why Muslims resent America is because we're so close to so many, corrupt and laughable family despots. I mean, I would argue, that's probably one reason too. I mean, I spent a year in Egypt, and everybody knows that the game is rigged in Egypt. Everybody knows, and everybody knows that we give them $2 billion a year. So. And everybody knows that we rely on their sadists and torturers, to interrogate terrorists. This arrangement did not start with Bush. Our arrangement with the Saudis did not start with Bush. So, in that respect, I mean,
I don't see how you can argue that Bush didn't take it to a new level. The Guantanamo Bay is a standing thumb in the eye of the world. The renditions. Now you have the British complaining because we did something as minor.
Well, the renditions started under the modern renditions program started under Bill Clinton, and renditions as a sort of practice and policy probably been around since the beginning of the CIA.
Yeah, but I think Bush took all these things to a new level. I mean, it's not an accident that the United States has become the most reviled country. We're seen as more dangerous than Iran around much of the world. You're telling me that's an accident?
Well, I guess my view of public diplomacy is that people respect winners at the end of the day, and the reason why I think we're reviled is because we're losing, or we're perceived to be losing, but not because I just don't think that I'm not persuaded by this argument that there are things that we can do. I mean, it's interesting you sort of say this because I think this is the big difference between Republicans and Democrats in 2008, which is that Republicans tend to be 9/11 Americans and Democrats tend to be Abu Ghraib Americans, which is that, Democrats believe that we can win the war and make our country more secure in the fight against Al-Qaida and Islamic terrorism by repenting for the excesses and the sins of the Bush administration. And, I'm not defending what happened in Abu Ghraib, and I happen to agree with John McCain about, we should restore the Army Field Manual as the sort of code of conduct for interrogations for the military. But in part, it's a little naive because the United States has been doing a lot of this stuff before, and we've gone through these kinds of things before. And secondly, I don't think it's necessarily right. I think that if we are perceived to be successful in Iraq, to have routed Al-Qaida, and ultimately to have routed the Iranians, then people will respect our power.
We're not going to rout the Iranians.
Well, we're not going to invade Iran. That's certainly true. But the Iranians did, and I think have tried to make a play for influence and power and try to sort of control chaos in a lot of Iraq. And as they lose their ability to do those sorts of things, and as Iraq emerges and is able to sort of exert its independence from Iran, that will redound also to our benefit. I think the next president, who will probably be Barack Obama, will be the, in many ways kind of receive the benefits of the surge if he doesn't prematurely end it. But
that's why I would differ with you about this 9/11 distinction that you drew between Republicans and Democrats, because I don't buy it. I think that if Hillary Clinton became president of the United States, she would weigh bombing Tehran, maybe even more than John McCain would. And I think Barack Obama is not going to be some pushover when it comes to foreign policy. That once you're sitting in that office, we know that presidents tend to... Bill Clinton, for example, said he was going to focus on the economy and ended up conducting a lot of military actions during his presidency. So I just don't buy that argument. It's also the case that Clinton took a pretty aggressive stance towards terrorism, more aggressive than Bush did before 9/11 took place. So I just don't buy it that the Democrats are pushovers when it comes to this national security.
I wasn't trying to say that... No, listen, I'm not saying that the Democrats are pushovers. And I, by the way, think that there's probably virtue in parts of both arguments. My point is that it's a way of approaching the problem, which is to say that most voters of the Democratic voters and people in America really believe that Bush has engendered a lot of enmity in the world. Also that Bush has... Keith Olbermann, windbag that he is, says this all the time. How dare you, Mr. President? You've made us less secure. And anyway...
And the argument there is that it's the neocon cabal that drove him to do that.
Well, I guess. I'd like to think that there's a variety of opinions. My point, though, is that Democrats look at the problem as, what is it that we can do to restore our standing in the international community and to make it less likely for Muslims who might be on the fence so that they don't join the jihad movement.
Now, is that such a terrible thing?
Well, no. I said there's virtues in both arguments, right? I think Republican voters tend to say, how do we kill and capture as many terrorists as possible? And that, therefore, it's a matter of priorities. Republicans, I don't think most Republicans reflexively defend, saying that waterboarding is wonderful and they want to do it for vengeance, maybe on the extremes. And just like I don't think that, Democrats are, saying, oh, no more kinetic warfare anywhere. Obviously, Democrats also believe that there's a role for Hellfire missiles and there's a role for intelligence actions and so forth and so on. It's a matter of what your priority is, what you choose to talk about, and how you approach this problem.
But if you get to this neocon view of the world, which I believe John McCain shares, the idea that military value, national honor, that you can actually defeat this problem with sufficient exercise of military force, I don't think so. I think we're facing a bunch of discrete groups of terrorists, and the fundamental mistake that both the Bush administration and the neocons made was to assume that terrorism was sponsored by states. It's often not. Al-Qaida, it's Osama bin Laden sitting there somewhere in Waziristan. Is he pulling puppets? No. But, he's managed to embolden and inspire a lot of autonomous groups. within Europe mainly to wreak havoc. And it sounds to me, when you talk about hunting down and killing all the terrorists, it sounds like a Sisyphean approach to me. I'm not against capturing terrorists and killing them and battling them as much as possible, but how are we going to nail down and track down every one of these people? It just seems that the public diplomacy does, in fact, have a pretty big role there in just stopping people from joining in the first place.
Well, I think we need to exploit the fact that so many Muslims really do hate Al-Qaida, and we need a good Islamic intra-civil war between. And I hate the fact that Bush always says we want moderates. I don't want moderates. I want liberal extremists in the Arab world. I want people who are. This is really in some ways a fight. It's their fight, and we need to figure out clever ways to support people who are willing to take them on. And this is sort of why, this is where I very much disagree with Michelle Malkin or Daniel Pipes, which is that I think it's great when the FBI reaches out to American, Arab, and Muslim groups because they're in a much better position to let us know what mosques might be supporting sleeper cells. What?
Let me put it more bluntly. Do you agree with Norman Podhoretz that this is World War IV and that any means are necessary and that we're battling for our very existence at this moment?
I do agree with Norman Podhoretz on the fact that it's potentially, given the technology available to small groups, we have to prevent disasters and we have to be right 100% of the time. Absolutely. Do I want to call it like World War IV? I don't know. Pick a. I don't know. I like to think of it more as like the war for civilization.
Well, what about Podhoretz's argument also that it's liberal traders at home who are subverting the battle? Do you agree with that?
That liberal traders at home are subverting the battle. No, I don't agree with the I'm very wary of it. But, hey, do you agree with the overheated rhetoric of 2005 that the neocons themselves are spies for Israel and traitors and so forth?
No.
Obviously not. I read the book, by the way.
Right. Thanks.
No. No, I don't, the notion of like liberal traders at home. I do think that there are moments when
one of the things we can't...
The discussion about waterboarding is context-free, Jacob. It is context-free, okay? First of all, it's inaccurate. I don't think that anybody waterboards anymore because they've come up with more and newer things to do during interrogations, which should probably be considered and are considered torture. But you're talking about a limited universe, and if you have politicians that are going to rail against black sites and rail against interrogation techniques and say even the CIA can't do it, then unless they're willing to come out and also say, and we're against rendition, at which point it opens up, so then what do you want to do with these people when we capture them, then it's a phony kind of argument. Because as I see it, if you're for rendition, or you don't say anything about rendition, or you continue the rendition policy, then that's probably in some ways worse overall than having a universe of 120 senior Al-Qaeda terrorists in black sites in Europe.
Well, the other point I would make here is to get at a more basic point is I don't think the American public really has the stomach for a World War IV, but this election campaign is going to demonstrate it to us. You have John McCain, who's very close to William Kristol, Robert Kagan, a lot of other neoconservatives, and is arguing we need to make this all-out effort in the war on terror. And you have Barack Obama on the other end, who's being advised by Anthony Lake and Samantha Power, who is, as you suggested earlier, preaching more closer foreign policy akin to Jimmy Carter, where we reach out and touch the rest of the world, and where we don't put the primary emphasis on military power. Though you never know. The events that a president confronts may completely upend his or her agenda. But nevertheless, right. I'm very skeptical. I think the neocon crusade is at a crossroads today. And if McCain is not elected, it's a clear signal to me that the idea that there's a World War IV is simply not accepted by the American public. We haven't had any attacks on American soil, and it's not clear how dire the menace is inside the United States. We know the intentions of the terrorists.
That's Norman Podhoretz. Norman Podhoretz wrote World War IV. I mean, it's not
But
like
that book has become
not
the
like every
rallying cry.
neoconservative, or if you want to call me, is coming around town saying, "I want the Americans to sign up." I mean, I would say it's much closer to say that neoconservatives are very skeptical of the fact that high-level meetings with the Iranians are going to yield any kind of acceptable result, or that even the Iranians would be interested in meeting in good faith, and that is based in large part on the history of our high-level meetings and negotiations with the North Koreans, which hasn't really resulted in much. I don't think this latest agreement is going to really get very far. I think the neoconservatives, in looking to the future, are going to still be incredibly critical of the UN as it is right now. And I might add that a lot of liberal internationalists and critics of the neocons have nothing to say about the corruption that has been uncovered at the UN management of the oil for food program, or for that matter, the failure of the UN to do anything about preventing rogue states and torture states and states that sponsor terrorism from participating as sort of members in good standing in all these little committees and so forth. So there are still lots of things that the neocons are going to talk about that are going to be relevant, and you're going to, in a policy context. And at some point, events change, and there's going to be, a need for looking at another framework. And keep in mind something else. As critical as the country is right now, and I would say, so there are in some cases very much excesses of Bush's prosecution of the war. If there's no attack in the rest of his presidency, and then there's attack in the next presidency, it's fairly natural politically for someone to go back and revisit those things, right?
Right, and I suppose it would depend on when it occurred in the next Democratic presidency, whether people would blame the president himself for having been asleep at the watch. But I still think it will be interesting, because the neoconservatives will certainly play a role if there's a Democratic presidency as the harshest critics of the Democrats. And isn't it a little fascinating that the neoconservatives have now become the furthest right flank of the Republican Party on foreign policy? In my mind, they have now inherited the rollback doctrine of the early 1950s, when you had the far right of the Republican Party saying we had to roll back communism in Eastern Europe. And today it's the neocons who very much turned to the argument, like you were suggesting before, that we still need to try and turn Iraq into a bastion of democracy. But I wonder...
Well, how is that a far right argument? I mean, I don't know. I kind of consider it fairly conservative what Flint Leverett wrote for the American Prospect a couple of years ago, which was that we need to reach out and subcontract the war to all these other family-owned despots in the Middle East. That's a pretty right-wing thing to do. I mean, the left used to criticize that as indirect imperialism.
That would be a realist argument. I mean, I was thinking before that if you were really a realist, what your argument, Eli, would be is that we should pit these various factions in the Islamic world against each other and not intervene directly.
No, I don't want a Sunni and Shia war. What I want is liberals versus lunatics. That's what I want. And I used to want nonviolent Otpor revolutions against tyrannies and so forth. And I still believe very much in the power of nonviolent movements, but I'm willing at this point to arm liberals.
But here's the central conundrum for you and the other neoconservatives. Has always been very skeptical about the Arab states. How was it that Iraq and Iraq alone is somehow immune from the pathologies that afflicted many Middle Eastern states over the past 100 years? Why was it that neoconservatives assumed that somehow this would have a domino effect in Iraq? Where are these liberals in the Middle East? There are a few, but it's not like, are you telling me that the whole population is just waiting to be liberated?
No, what I'm saying is that I'm saying I think liberalism at the end of the day is inescapable in the current age. They all have the internet. They all are exposed to all of these ideas that we are exposed to.
Pakistan just shut down YouTube.
What?
Pakistan just shut down YouTube.
Yeah, and they'll probably and you adjust and you figure out a way around it. Listen, I'm not saying that I'm not necessarily arguing for Contras, though.
But didn't Nazi Germany show you can ally, that there's no inherent contradiction between a quasi-capitalist economy, a totalitarian government, and an emphasis on high technology. Why does liberalism?
No, you're missing that. I'm saying that the
future?
free flow of ideas and the fact that there is a suffocation of economic and political opportunities, okay, in my opinion, is probably the most significant cause of why people choose to grow beards the size of their fist and memorize the Quran. And there is a tremendous amount of oil money that from Saudi Arabia that is used to sort of promote these radical madrasas, which find homeless kids and try to turn them into suicide bombers. And I think that one of the reasons why Bush's kind of vision failed in some ways is because he was never able to really confront Saudi Arabia, which may be explained by the close connections between the Bush family and the House of Saud, or the fact that the U.S. government and the U.S. has a close relationship with the House of Saud. And finally, of course, as we're seeing with $3 a gallon oil, it would be far worse if there was a rift there. But ultimately, we need to figure out, obviously, some alternative to petroleum because the Saudis are a big problem in this. But,
you're right. And neocons like Ken Edelman have been, very critical of the Saudis. But let's say you had dynamited this Saudi regime after 9/11. I mean, it would have been even more chaos, wouldn't it? I mean, if you want to, if you have this idea, the neocons
you can't invade. I mean, it's a pickle. What I'm saying is that there was never an acknowledgement that if you were going to fight this sort of evil, movement and this sort of in the Middle East, that you had to at some point confront Saudi Arabia.
But how pervasive when you call it an evil movement? Isn't that being in a way giving it more legitimacy than it deserves? How pervasive do you really think that this movement is? It's obviously supported by Iran. You have Hezbollah, but is it really again a giant war on terror? Are we facing disgruntled malcontents on the fringes of their society?
What we're facing is highly organized people who are willing to use vicious violence to achieve their political ends. They've done so briefly in Afghanistan. They're trying to do it in Afghanistan again. They're trying to do it in Pakistan. They did it briefly in Sudan, and they still, you could argue, they're still in power in Sudan. And from the Shia variety, they did it in Iran and in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, and now we see in Gaza. And you could argue that at least the Saudi educational system, its charities, and, I don't know. Saudi Arabia is a very interesting subject, and there was an effort to try to do this also in Iraq. So, they have political ambitions.
But
I don't think it's overwrought to say that it's not overwrought to kind of quote them and say that they can do it. Now, do they have the means to do it? Well, they've as I said, they have. The first was Iran. They had Afghanistan briefly. They have Sudan. There's a chance I could certainly see with Pakistan. And there's also a kind of undercurrent as well, which is that this is the ascendant strain of Islam as well. So you're seeing it kind of all over. So yeah, it is, I think, a big threat.
But again, that ascendancy gets back to the question of, obviously, yes, it is, in some part, there's a return to religiosity. The article suggests in Egypt because of the corruption of the Mubarak regime.
Right.
But I also think maybe this neocon approach was catastrophic because it didn't, if you're really going to do this, you'd have to go all the way at one blow or not at all. Maybe we ended up with the worst of all worlds, is where
because we didn't go all the way.
Well, we certainly angered the Arab world by attacking Iraq. But I think that would be the only plausible.
Can I just also add that, Saddam was not just a bad dictator. I mean, Mubarak is a dictator, but Saddam was worse, far worse. And the U.S. did have some complicity in the misery of Iraq.
I think it gets back to that distinction that Jeane Kirkpatrick made between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes.
Yeah.
Mubarak, yeah, I suppose he doesn't have a cult of personality the way
he hasn't killed as many people and for as trifling as reasons as Saddam. He doesn't have, psychopathic sons who are going to inherit the country. And there's a lot
But that's the argument for leaving these regimes alone. I mean, you have Jordan, which is quaking. You have Egypt, which is...
Well, I mean, I should say, right now, just so nobody gets it twisted, we can't invade any more countries. It's not an agenda item. There will never be another war like that. There will never be an invasion like that. So there has to be other strategies. But I am still a regime changer. I don't think that the world needs to see the kind of continuation of the Assad dynasty. But why? Why?
So are you a chastened neocon?
I'm not. I don't know that I mean, first of all, I don't necessarily I always used to like to refer to myself as a paleo-liberal, as briefly Irving Kristol did, because I see myself as coming to the kind of foreign policy principles from a belief in liberalism and the universality of sort of negative rights, at least, and also, I'm a big America Firster, and I suppose I'm a neocon in just the following sense, which is that when I was in college, I was this close to a Stalinism. I mean, I wanted, I signed petitions for sons and daughters of the Cuban Revolution, and I
see you are a classic neocon,
well, that's what I'm saying. But I think that neoconservatism only really refers to people who've kind of gone right. But my personal path to how I became conservative is when I came to Washington in 1994 after working for Democrats in the election cycle in opposition research and became a reporter. I covered the Environmental Protection Agency. I read Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek. I mean, they're not really neocon thinkers. I kind of embraced conservatism from experiencing covering a bureaucracy. It wasn't like, in a sort of very traditional sense, and it wasn't even really overnight. I can't even remember a moment where I kind of converted or something. And it's not really a cabal either. I just you sort of find the places as if you're, we're both journalists. You find people who...
I think cabal is the wrong word. I think it's more of it's a network of friends and family.
Yeah, there was this... Remember Lawrence Wilkerson went and said this whole cabal thing,
But you have to understand, he was talking about something very specific, which was the tight links between Cheney and Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and Doug Feith, who are all in the Pentagon. So I think Wilkerson, I saw his original talk at the New America Institute, and he was a little over the top. I think basically he turned out to have it right, but he'd been in the trenches, and
I covered Wilkerson at the State Department.
Isn't that a phenomenon of people who either deal with neoconservatives or write about them? They seem to become infected by some of the zealotry themselves.
I suppose. I don't know. I think that the book, in the end of the day, you're trying to sort of argue for a certain a neoconservative style, and I don't know. And there are so many schisms, and you're talking about such a small group of kind of reporters and intellectuals and policy wonks, and it's and I think that it's more kind of case specific. The alliances.
But if you look at the Weekly Standard and commentary, they tend to be very sarcastic. They often impugn the motives of their opponents. Bill Kristol.
Right. By the way, you know who the new neocons are? If you just want to go on the neocon style, the new neocons are the young Turk bloggers. Like Matthew Yglesias is the most sarcastic writer I've ever read on the left. I think
he's
a neocon.
Right. In a way, they may be the progeny, unwittingly, of the neoconservatives.
Well, that's the whole thing. It's interesting because this whole new left phenomenon, which is very interesting, is that they love the fact that they want to follow Grover Norquist, who himself followed Saul Alinsky. And then as a writing style, you're right, it's like the Weekly Standard of the mid-'90s in some ways.
But if you look at our friends...
It's very dismissive, exactly.
Right, but our friend Spencer Ackerman, for example, follows them with morbid fascination, the neoconservatives. So in a way,
Spencer is a little fascinated by the neoconservatives. He's my friend, but I can say this.
But
he's gone a little bit off the rails on that.
Well, I think he's quite interesting, but
he's a combative young talent.
Exactly. So he's kind of the anti. He used to be
quite
a
neocon
himself, I think.
The what?
I think he might have been a neocon at one point or sympathetic. But he's an example.
Everybody was this is the other thing I wanted to say just about Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. Who wasn't a fascist or a communist in the 1920s and 1930s? Everybody was who was an intellectual, right?
But there was a difference. Being a Trotskyist really was different than being a Stalinist.
I agree with you. Being a Trotskyist was
just like being a liberal hawk is different from being a neocon.
I suppose. The big difference between liberal hawks and neocons, by the way, is that liberal hawks still want, to do stuff with international institutions, if not the UN itself.
Right.
I think that's the big difference.
Right.
But anyway. But back to I think it is an interesting question of the sort of this style, and
I don't know. To me, it's undeniable that there's a certain style, but
I mean, is Bernard Lewis a neocon? And if Bernard Lewis is a neocon, like his style is not like that. I don't know. There's a lot of you can come up with counterexamples too.
Sure, but I'm talking about if you go look at the Bolsheviks, was Zinoviev exactly the same as Stalin? No. Was Bukharin? Bukharin was soft-tempered, but that didn't mean he didn't want to go out and kill people.
Well, neocons don't want to go out and kill people. What is that?
I'm not talking about killing people. I'm just talking about styles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at any movement, there's a certain thing around which there is a certain mindset or approach. I think part of the problem with the neocons is maybe they get examined too closely. I mean, if you can split hairs all day, right? Gene Kirkpatrick had different views than Norman Fedoritz at this point, than Daniel Patrick Moynihan, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. But they will. I mean, on the classic example of what defined the neoconservatives in the 70s and the 80s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote the book Secrecy, which was a critique in large part of what he said was threat inflation of the Soviets, which was a direct rebuke of the neocons who he was associated with when he was applying principles of social science to the welfare state.
Right. But he broke with the neocons in the 80s over the Soviet issue already. And again, that's one of the things I talk about in the book is there may be more neocon apostates at this point than there are neocons.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, if I could say that I have a project, if anything, is sort of from a policy perspective, I would like to get the government out of democracy promotion. Because I just don't think that the U.S. government can do it. I don't, and in part it's born out of a kind of skepticism about the Foreign Service, which I think does a very good job at being diplomats, but diplomats have to deal with governments as they are and not try to change them. And, I'd like to see, I think that, in fact, neoconservatives would probably follow a Soros model for the Middle East and find billionaires who are willing to come up with ways to support liberal movements in the Middle East, which I don't think, by the way, is a pipe dream, and figure out a way to do it on their
That would be an interesting approach.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I think has got to be the answer. And I look at it in part because, you know what? If this stuff was so compromised, and it was so compromised by this administration, which is that the neocons did not really rule the roost. They were probably most influential in terms of the rhetoric of the president, and very, very not nearly as influential as they're given credit for in terms of the actual policies that were pursued in large part, particularly for the region writ large and the world writ large, that if they can't get it done with President Bush, who I think you're right, really did convert after meeting Sharansky and giving that speech in 2005 for the second inaugural, then it's never going to, you could have, I don't know, you could have President Wolfowitz, which I would support, by the way.
This is why I want you to write the next book about the neocons.
I'm not going to write a book about the neocons. I'm going to write a book about freedom. That's the thing. I'm through with it. I mean, because the neocon has become such a weird word. It's like, in a weird way, though, like reading the book, it's like the neocons are kind of like the Rolling Stones, which is like, they were really good in the 70s.
Exactly.
And then they just kind of, anyway.
The act has faded.
And then the Rolling Stones wrote that song, My Sweet Neocon, which sucked. Anyway.
But there may be a comeback. We'll see.
Yes, we will see. Anyway, Jacob, this was fun. This was good stuff, and it was good. We ought to do it again.
I loved it.
All right, man.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.